My mother said the sentence like she was reading me the weather. We've decided Priya should be maid of honor instead. She understands the family better. I was holding a fork with a piece of my sister's wedding cake sample on it, the lemon one, the one I'd suggested, and I remember setting it down very carefully, the way you set down something you're afraid you might otherwise throw across a kitchen you grew up in. Nobody at that table truly expected what happened next, because what happened next was nothing at all. No gasp. No argument. No, how could you? I didn't raise my voice. I never do. That's what scared them, later, when they talked about it among themselves, not that I fought back but that I didn't. People who love you get used to being able to predict your hurt. They know the shape it usually takes, the words you usually reach for, the exact volume at which your voice will crack. When you finally hurt differently than they expect, it unsettles them far more than anger ever could. For a long moment, the only sound at that table was the clink of my aunt's fork against her plate, and somewhere behind me the refrigerator hummed the way it always had, oblivious, indifferent, as if nothing in the room had just quietly rearranged itself. I remember thinking, absurdly, that the lemon cake was actually very good, and that it was strange to notice something so small in the middle of something so large. I want to tell you about the 11 months that led to that dinner, because the sentence itself isn't the story. The story is everything I already knew, quietly, long before my mother said it out loud, sitting there over cake samples like she was confirming a delivery date. By the time she got around to telling me I'd been replaced, I had already decided what I would do about it. I just hadn't told anyone yet, and I wasn't planning to, not until the moment actually arrived. I didn't cry at that table. I smiled, I said one sentence weeks later at the reception itself, and I left before the band had even finished the song between toasts. And if you stay with me, I'll tell you exactly what that sentence was, and why, 3 weeks later, it was the only thing anyone in my family could still remember about that entire wedding, more than the flowers, more than the vows, more than the first dance. But first, you need to understand who I was to this family, before I became someone they could quietly replace over lemon cake in a kitchen my own father built. I'm 31. I have an older brother, Daniel, 34, and a younger sister, Elena, 26, who is the one who got engaged last spring to a man named Marcus, a structural engineer, with a laugh you can hear through 2 closed doors and a habit of remembering everyone's coffee order after hearing it exactly once. I liked him immediately, which matters, because it means none of what follows was ever about him. Marcus had nothing to do with what my family did. If anything, he was the only person who seemed uncomfortable with it from the start, and I'll get to that later. Growing up, I was the one who fixed things. Not in a martyr way. I want to be honest about that, because it would be easy to tell this story like I was some quiet saint circling a family of monsters, and that's not what this is. I fixed things because I was good at it, and because being good at it got me a specific kind of attention that felt, for a long time, like love. In our house, competence was currency. If you could be counted on, you were counted in. When my parents' small import business nearly folded during a bad stretch 8 years ago, I was the one who took 2 weeks of unpaid leave from my own job to rebuild their books line by line and renegotiate with their supplier over 3 tense phone calls. I remember sitting at my father's desk until 2 in the morning, translating his handwritten invoices into spreadsheets he could actually read, while he sat across from me looking both grateful and faintly embarrassed that his daughter had to do it. When my grandmother's health started declining, I was the one who drove 90 minutes each way, every other weekend, for nearly 3 years, sitting with her through doctor's appointments my parents were too busy to attend, before we finally moved her into assisted living, and I was the one who filled out the 11 pages of paperwork nobody else in the family wanted to touch. When Daniel's first marriage ended, badly and suddenly, I was the one who let him sleep on my couch for 4 months, and never once brought up rent, who sat with him at 2 in the morning more than once while he cried about a version of his life he thought he'd already secured. None of this was resentful at the time. I want to be clear about that too. I did it because I loved these people, and because in our family, showing up was the language we spoke instead of saying things directly. We didn't say, "I'm proud of you." We said, "Did you eat?" and we meant it as the same sentence translated. I understood that dialect fluently, better than anyone else in the family, or so I believed. I still mostly believe it. I just no longer believe fluency in a language guarantees anyone will keep speaking it back to you. I worked in operations for a mid-sized logistics company, a job that suited me in ways I only half understood at the time. I liked systems. I liked the quiet satisfaction of untangling something that looked chaotic until you found the one thread that made it make sense. My colleagues used to joke that I ran my own life the way I ran supply chains, efficiently, with contingency plans, with very little patience for things falling through the cracks. I brought that same energy home, always, without ever being asked to. It didn't occur to me for years that a family isn't actually a supply chain, and that the people in it don't necessarily want to be optimized. I only started to understand that difference much later, and by then the pattern was already 15 years deep. Elena is 5 years younger than me, and for most of our childhood I was less a sister to her, and more a second, smaller mother, packing her lunches when our parents were consumed by the business, sitting up with her during a bad breakup her sophomore year of college, driving for hours through a snowstorm the year she called me at midnight because her apartment had flooded and she didn't know who else to call at that hour. I remember arriving at 3 in the morning, soaked, hauling her waterlogged furniture into the hallway with her, both of us laughing eventually out of sheer exhaustion. I don't say any of this to keep score. I say it because it's the frame you need to understand what came later, because when my mother told me, over cake samples, that I understood the family less than the woman my brother had stopped dating 14 months earlier, I wasn't just losing a title on a wedding program. I was being told that a decade and a half of showing up meant less than 18 months of being easy to like. Priya came into our lives through Daniel, back when they started dating almost 2 years before the wedding planning began. She was warm in the specific, practiced way some people are warm, the kind of warm that makes a room feel managed rather than comforted, though I didn't see that clearly at first, not for a long while. She learned my mother's recipes, standing beside her in the kitchen for hours some Sundays. She sat through my father's long stories about his own father's shop without checking her phone once, asking follow-up questions that made him light up. She called my grandmother every Sunday, without fail, right up until the breakup, and it turned out, for a long while after it too, which nobody thought to mention to me until much later. My family adored her, openly and without complication, in a way they had never quite adored me, not out loud, not in that easy, unguarded way. I noticed that, but I didn't resent it, not then. I told myself it was good for Daniel to be with someone the family loved so completely. I told myself a lot of generous things that year, because generosity, for me, had always been the price of belonging, and I paid it without checking the total. When Daniel and Priya broke up, quietly and without much visible drama on either side, I assumed, reasonably, I thought, and I think most people would have thought the same, that her role in our family would fade the way exes' roles usually do. A few holiday texts, maybe. A happy birthday, here and there for a year or two before it tapered off entirely. That's what happens in every other family I've ever known. That's what's supposed to happen. I remember, specifically, a Thanksgiving about a year into Daniel and Priya's relationship, when my mother pulled her into the kitchen to teach her how to make my grandmother's stuffing recipe, a recipe that had, until that point, only ever been taught to me. I stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the two of them laugh over a measuring cup, and told myself it was sweet, that there was room in a kitchen for more than one daughter learning a family's recipes. I believed that, mostly. I think I still believe some version of it. What I didn't yet understand was that my mother wasn't adding a second daughter to the kitchen. She was quietly auditioning a replacement for one she had already, in some private, unspoken way, grown tired of. That is not what happened in mine. I want to be fair here, because it would be easy to make Priya into a villain, and she wasn't one, not really, not in the way this story could tempt you to imagine her. She never lobbied for the maid of honor role, as far as I ever saw. She never asked to be inserted into wedding planning meetings, or invited on the dress-fitting trip. As far as I could tell, every step of what happened was initiated by my mother, and eventually, by Elena herself. Priya simply never said no. I think that's worth sitting with, more than any accusation I could level at her. She never once said no to any of it, and neither, for a very long time, did I. It would have been easier, in some ways, if she had been unkind. Unkindness is simple to point at. What actually happened was quieter and harder to name, and I spent most of 11 months trying to find language for it that didn't sound like I was accusing a genuinely decent person of a crime she never consciously committed. The dinner where it happened was supposed to be ordinary. Elena had asked our mother, our Aunt Rosa, and me to help narrow down the cake flavors for the tasting, which is a small, almost sweet kind of errand, the sort of afternoon that exists in every wedding planning season, forgettable by design, the kind of thing you assume you'll remember fondly and vaguely, not in exact, aching detail. We sat at the kitchen table my father built when I was 9. I remember the smell of sawdust in the garage that whole summer, going through 6 little plated squares of cake with toothpick flags, laughing about how the champagne vanilla one tasted exactly like the classic vanilla one, and for about 40 minutes, it was just us being a family the way I remembered being one, before I understood how much of that memory was already ending. Then Elena set her fork down, glanced at our mother in a way I recognized, a look that meant she'd rehearsed something and needed backup to say it, and said, I wanted to tell you before it's official. I asked Priya to be my maid of honor. I want to be honest about the half-second after that sentence, because it wasn't shock exactly. It was the specific, sinking recognition of watching something you already suspected finally happen out loud, the way you feel when a diagnosis you'd quietly feared gets said aloud by a doctor instead of just lived with in private dread. I had noticed, over the previous few months, that Priya had been at more planning conversations than I had. I had noticed that she'd been the one Elena texted about seating charts, not me. I had told myself those were coincidences, the way you tell yourself a lot of things when the alternative is admitting you already know something you aren't ready to know. My Aunt Rosa reached for her water glass. My mother rearranged the little cake plates so the toothpick flags all faced the same direction, a habit of hers when a conversation made her uncomfortable, tidying whatever was physically in front of her, as if order on the table could substitute for order in the room. Oh, I said. I didn't realize that was still, I thought, I know you probably assumed it'd be you, Elena said, too quickly, the way people talk when they've practiced the next part in a mirror or a shower. And I love you, I do, but Priya's just been so much more available, and she really gets how our family does things, you know. Mom agrees. That's when my mother said it. Not cruelly. That's the part one need you to understand, the part that made it so much harder to hold on to simple anger. There was no venom in her voice, no triumph, nothing that would have made it easier to be furious at her cleanly. She said it the way you'd confirm a scheduling detail on a shared calendar. We've decided Priya should be maid of honor instead. She understands the family better. I looked at my Aunt Rosa, hoping for some flicker of discomfort, some silent ally at the table, someone whose face would tell me I wasn't losing my mind. She was very interested in the tablecloth. I didn't say anything for a moment. I picked my fork back up, put it down again, feeling the specific, physical strangeness of a room you know by heart suddenly feeling unfamiliar. I asked, evenly, understands the family better than I do. You know what I mean, my mother said, already reaching for the next cake sample, already moving on, as if the conversation had concluded rather than only just detonated somewhere under the table. You're always so busy. Priya has time. She's around. It's not a judgment on you, sweetheart, it's practical. I want you to notice that word, practical, because it is going to matter later, in a way none of them anticipated at that table, over cake, on an ordinary Tuesday that I will remember for the rest of my life. Does Priya even know how to give a maid of honor toast? I asked, not really meaning it as a challenge, more as a genuine attempt to keep the conversation in a register I could still manage. Has she done all the logistics before? The dress fittings, the shower, all of it. She's a fast learner, my mother said, smiling, and I understood, in that small exchange, that this had already been decided in a way no answer of mine could touch. It wasn't a discussion. It was an announcement dressed politely as one. I said I understood. I said it was fine. I helped finish narrowing down the cake flavors, my voice perfectly level the whole time, no one at that table any wiser about what had just been quietly rearranged inside me. At one point Elena reached over and squeezed my hand, grateful, relieved that I hadn't made it a whole thing, and I remember smiling back at her and thinking how strange it was that my composure, the very thing I was famous for in this family, had just been used as proof that I didn't need to be considered in the first place. I drove home that night with both hands steady on the wheel, past the intersection where I used to pick Elena up from her college dorm, past the grocery store where I'd once bought supplies for my grandmother's move into assisted living, small landmarks of everything I'd quietly built this family's stability out of, and did not cry until I was parked in my own driveway with the engine off, and even then, only for about 4 minutes, because I have never been someone who lets herself do that for very long. The next 11 months were a slow education in exactly how little that practical reasoning had to do with practicality, and how much it had to do with something my family had never once said to me directly. It started small. I wasn't looped into the group chat that got created for wedding logistics, MOH plus bridesmaids, it was called, and I only found out it existed because Elena's cousin mentioned it at a birthday dinner 2 months later, casually, assuming I already knew, watching my face change as I realized I did not. When I asked Elena about it, gently, trying to keep the hurt out of my voice, she looked genuinely embarrassed for about 4 seconds and said she'd add me to the bigger one, which turned out to be a second, much quieter chat that received maybe 1 message a month, mostly logistics about hotel blocks and shuttle times. The real planning, the dress shopping, the shower brainstorming, the seating chart debates that stretched across 40 messages a night, the inside jokes that accumulate the way inside jokes always do among people who are actually present for each other's days, happened in the other one, the one with Priya in it, the one I was never once invited to, not even after I found out it existed. I told myself again that this was an oversight. I am good at telling myself things. I have had a lifetime of practice. Then came the dress fitting. Elena had picked a boutique 2 hours away, a whole-day trip, the kind of thing sisters are supposed to do together regardless of titles, regardless of anything. I found out about it through a photo Priya posted, the two of them and our cousin Naomi, holding mimosas in a sunlit boutique with mirrors on every wall, captioned, "She said yes to the dress." Ring 3 days after it had already happened, 3 days after I had spent that particular Saturday doing laundry and grocery shopping, unaware that 120 miles away my sister was choosing her wedding dress without me. When I texted Elena, hurt but trying not to sound it, asking why I hadn't been invited, she said, "I didn't think you'd want to take a whole Saturday, you're always so slammed at work," and then, almost as an afterthought, almost as if it explained everything, Priya offered to drive, it was just easier. Easier. That word again, wearing a different coat, showing up in a new room like it had never left. I want to walk you through a few more of these, because it's the accumulation that matters here, not any single moment, the way water doesn't carve a canyon in one afternoon but eventually carves one all the same. There was a Sunday phone call, early in the planning, where my mother asked me to help coordinate vendor payments, the caterer's deposit, the florist's contract, because, she said, "You're so good with numbers," and Priya's a little overwhelmed with all of it. I remember feeling, for a strange moment, almost hopeful, like maybe I hadn't actually been pushed out after all, just quietly reassigned to a different, less visible kind of usefulness. I spent 6 hours that week reconciling vendor invoices against the budget spreadsheet, catching a $400 overcharge from the florist that nobody else had noticed, and when I mentioned it at dinner, my father said, "See, this is why we need you," in a tone that was meant as a compliment and landed, instead, as a small, precise confirmation of exactly what my role in this wedding had quietly become: useful, invisible, and untitled. There was the engagement party, where Priya gave a toast, a genuinely warm, well-delivered toast. I'll give her that much credit, because credit where it's due matters to me even now. That reference, watching Elena grow up these past 2 years like she was my own little sister, a sentence that landed in my chest like a paper cut, small and precise and somehow worse for how clean it was, how casually it erased 26 years of an actual sisterhood in favor of 2. There was the bridal shower planning, where I was asked to help with logistics, which turned out to mean picking up 60 folding chairs from my parents' garage in the July heat, and being the one who stayed late afterward to clean up spilled punch and stray ribbon off the floor, while Priya cut the ribbon on the gift-opening ceremony itself and sat, laughing, in the decorated chair reserved for the maid of honor beside the bride, a chair with her name written on it in gold calligraphy that someone, not me, had clearly ordered weeks in advance. There was the moment at that same shower, when my grandmother, 86 years old, sharp as ever, sharper than most people gave her credit for, leaned over to me and asked, not unkindly, genuinely puzzled, "Whose girlfriend is that again?" The one doing everything, and I had to explain, quietly, that she wasn't anyone's girlfriend anymore, hadn't been for well over a year, and my grandmother just nodded slowly and said, "Well. She's certainly taken to it," in a tone I couldn't quite read, one that has stayed with me since, because I think my grandmother understood something the rest of the family hadn't yet let themselves see. There was a smaller moment too, one I almost didn't include because it seems so minor on its own. At a family dinner in the spring, Elena mentioned, offhand, that Priya was helping her pick out gifts for the bridesmaids, and my mother said, warmly, without any apparent awareness of what she was saying, "She has such good taste, doesn't she? It's like having another daughter around." I sat 2 feet away, an actual daughter, and said nothing, because by then I had started keeping a private ledger of these small sentences, not to use them against anyone, just to understand, privately, what was actually happening to me. I tried, twice, to talk to my mother directly, because I still believed, for a long time, that this was a misunderstanding rather than a decision. The first time was over the phone, a few weeks after the cake tasting, when I asked, carefully, without accusation, in the calmest voice I could manage, whether there was something specific I'd done that made her think I wasn't the right fit anymore. She sighed in the particular way she sighs when she thinks I'm being sensitive, a sigh I have heard my entire life, and have never once learned to brace for properly, and said, "This isn't about you doing anything wrong. You've always been the responsible one. Priya's just easier to be around lately. Softer. You get so serious about things." I asked what things, genuinely wanting to understand. She said, "Everything. You turn everything into a project." I didn't have a response to that in the moment, because there was truth buried somewhere in it, even if it wasn't the truth she thought it was. I had turned this family into a project, for 15 years, out of love, out of a desire to hold us together through every hard stretch, and now the project's very completion had apparently made me less lovable to be around, not more, a paradox I have not fully stopped turning over even now. The second attempt was worse. I brought it up with Elena directly, over coffee at the place we used to go together in college, trying to keep my voice light and unaccusatory. I told her it hurt, being left out of the planning chat, the dress trip, the small daily texture of her engagement that I had always assumed, naively, I'd be woven into. She got defensive fast, faster than I expected, faster than felt fair, and said something that I've turned over in my mind more than almost anything else in this whole year, something I don't think I'll ever fully stop hearing. "You make it complicated, being close to you. There's always this weight to it. Like I owe you something for everything you've done. With Priya it's just fun. It's just easy." I remember driving home that day thinking, very clearly, in words I could have written down, 15 years of showing up, translated by my own sister into a debt she resented paying, and a debt she had apparently decided to settle by hiring someone else to take my place at the register. There was also the bachelorette weekend, which I want to describe carefully, because it's the one that made the pattern impossible for me to keep explaining away as coincidence. I was invited. I want to be fair about that. I wasn't excluded outright, but the itinerary had clearly been built around Priya's preferences from the start, a spa town she'd suggested, a restaurant she'd already been to with Daniel years earlier and wanted to revisit, a playlist she'd curated that Elena gushed about in the group chat I finally had access to by then. I spent the weekend in a strange, hollow role I didn't have a name for, present, smiling in every photo, technically included, and somehow still peripheral the entire time, the way a piece of furniture is included in a room without anyone building the room around it. At one point, late on the second night, slightly drunk, Elena leaned her head on my shoulder and said, "I'm so glad you're here," with real warmth in her voice, and I remember feeling almost dizzy with how much I wanted that sentence to mean what it used to mean, and how uncertain I'd become about whether it still did. There was also a moment, smaller but no less telling, when the hotel concierge, arranging our dinner reservation, asked which of us was the maid of honor so he could confirm the seating, and 3 separate people at the table pointed to Priya, instantly, without hesitation, the way you point to the sun when someone asks where it is. Nobody even glanced my way first. I laughed along with the table. I ordered another drink. I did not let my face do anything except exactly what it had always done at family gatherings, which was hold steady no matter what was happening underneath it. There was one more escalation I need to tell you about, because it's the one that finally cracked something loose in me, the one that made the decision I hadn't yet consciously made start to feel inevitable. 6 weeks before the wedding, there was a rehearsal dinner seating conversation, and my father, who had mostly stayed out of all of this, the way he stays out of most things that require him to take a side, mentioned offhand over dinner that he assumed I'd still be doing a toast, since you're basically the second maid of honor anyway, right? And my mother, without missing a beat, without even glancing up from her plate, said, "Oh, she doesn't need to. Priya's got the toast covered. We don't want to make the night longer than it needs to be. Doesn't need to." I sat with that phrase for a long time, turning it over the way you turn over a stone looking for what's living underneath it. I want to be honest, there was a version of me, somewhere in the middle of those 11 months, that seriously considered fighting for the title back outright. Sending an email. Calling a family meeting. Laying out, chronologically, everything I'd done for this family across 15 years, like Exhibit A through Exhibit Z, and demanding they weigh it, formally, against 18 months of Priya being, in my mother's own word, easier. I drafted that email once, actually, late one night, 3 glasses of wine deep, cataloging the unpaid leave, the assisted living paperwork, the couch, the snowstorm drive, the 11 pages of forms nobody else would fill out. I read it back the next morning, sober, and deleted it, not because it wasn't true. Every word of it was true, but because I understood, reading it in the cold light of a Tuesday morning, that presenting evidence to people who have already decided what they want to believe doesn't change their verdict. It just makes you the one who kept score, the bitter one, the project maker, exactly the label my mother had already reached for. So I stopped trying to be reselected. I started instead to watch. Quietly. Carefully. Not for ammunition, I want to be clear about that, because this isn't a story where I go digging for something to use against anyone at the reception. I watched because I needed, for my own sake, to understand what I was actually looking at, to name it correctly even if only to myself. I want to be precise about what watching actually looked like in practice, because it wasn't dramatic. It was mostly just paying closer attention at dinners, noticing who got asked follow-up questions and who got a polite nod, noticing whose stories got repeated back at the next family gathering and whose got quietly forgotten by the following week. It's a strange kind of research to conduct on your own family, and I don't recommend it as a way to spend a year, but it gave me something I badly needed by the end of it, certainty. Not certainty that anyone had acted with malice, but certainty that a pattern existed, real and repeatable, regardless of anyone's intentions inside it. And the longer I watched, the more I noticed something nobody else seemed to be noticing out loud. Priya wasn't just filling a role. She was auditioning for a family, quietly, patiently, the way you audition for something you intend to keep for good. And my family, hungry in a way I hadn't fully understood until that year, was auditioning her right back, for a version of a daughter and a sister that didn't come with 15 years of complicated, effortful, occasionally exhausting history attached to it. I started noticing, too, how my parents talked about Priya to other people, to neighbors, to their own siblings, to the woman who cut my mother's hair every 6 weeks. I overheard my mother, at a cousin's graduation party, describe Priya as practically part of the family now, in a tone so easy and unguarded that I understood, hearing it, that this wasn't a phrase she'd landed on in the moment. It was a sentence she had clearly said before, more than once, to people I would never meet, building a version of our family's story in which I simply occupied less space than I had always assumed I did. I didn't say any of this out loud. Not to my mother, not to Elena, not even to Daniel, who I suspect saw more of it than he ever let on, who I would later learn had noticed almost everything and simply hadn't known what to do with what he saw. I just kept showing up, smaller each time, to fewer things, saying yes when I was asked and saying nothing when I wasn't, and underneath all of it, quietly, privately, I started deciding what I would do when the moment finally came that required a response instead of just another absorption. The lowest point came about 3 weeks before the wedding, at what should have been a happy errand, picking up my own bridesmaid dress alteration, alone, because nobody had thought to invite me to do it alongside the others, alongside Priya, who had gone with Elena the previous weekend for what Elena had described in a text as just a quick fun thing, didn't want to make you drive out for something so small. I stood in the fitting room mirror in pale blue chiffon, a dress I would wear to stand slightly behind the woman my brother used to date while she stood beside my sister, in the position I had assumed, my whole adult life, would eventually be mine, and I let myself, finally, feel the whole shape of it. Not just the missed dress trip, or the group chat, or the toast I wasn't asked to give. All of it stacked, the way you finally feel the full weight of something you've been carrying only in pieces. I didn't cry in that fitting room either. I've noticed that about myself, over the years. The tears come later, alone, in cars, in the 15 minutes I allow myself before I have to be fine again for whoever needs me next. What I did instead, standing there under the fitting room's unflattering fluorescent light, was make a decision, and it wasn't the decision I expected myself to make, not the one 11 months of hurt would have predicted. I wasn't going to confront anyone. I wasn't going to boycott the wedding, or deliver a speech nobody asked for, or finally read that deleted email out loud at the reception like some avenging angel with a printed list of grievances tucked into her clutch. I understood, standing in that dress under those lights, that the version of justice I actually wanted wasn't public humiliation for anyone, not even for the people who had earned it. It was simpler than that, and I think, in its own way, harder. I wanted to stop performing a love that was no longer being received as love. I wanted, for the first time in 15 years, to choose myself, quietly, without asking anyone's permission first, without waiting to be granted the space to do it. So I decided on one sentence. Not a speech. Not a scene. One sentence for whenever the moment came that someone, inevitably, tried to make me explain myself or perform gratitude or absorb one more piece of this, and then I would leave. Calmly. Without drama, without slamming a single door. I wrote the sentence down on the back of a parking receipt in my car that day and kept it folded in my wallet for the following 3 weeks, taking it out sometimes just to read it silently, the way you'd check that a key still fits a lock you're afraid might have been changed without telling you. I told exactly one person what I'd decided, Marcus of all people, my sister's fiancé, who called me 2 days later, unprompted, out of nowhere, and said, I don't know everything that's happened, but I know something has, and I want you to know I see it, and I'm sorry. I didn't tell him the sentence itself. I just told him I was going to be at the wedding, that I loved Elena more than any of this had managed to touch, and that I wasn't planning to make a scene of any kind. He said, quietly, in a voice that surprised me with how steady it was, you don't have to earn a place at this wedding. You're her sister. I remember that sentence landing somewhere the others hadn't been able to reach in 11 long months. I hung up the phone that night and sat for a while in my kitchen, the same kind of kitchen my father had built a table for, in a different apartment, a different life, and I thought about how strange it was that the one piece of unconditional recognition I'd received all year came from a man who had known this family for less time than Priya had. Maybe that was the point, I thought. Maybe it takes someone standing just outside a pattern to see it clearly, while the rest of us, tangled up inside it for years, mistake the shape of the cage for the shape of the room. I slept badly that night, and better the next, and by the time the wedding was a week and a half away, I noticed something had settled quietly in me that I hadn't fully expected, not anger exactly, and not sadness either, but a kind of clarity, cool and steady, like water finally finding its own level again after being shaken hard for a long, long time. The wedding day arrived the way wedding days always seem to, both too fast and impossibly slow, and it was, by every external measure, beautiful. String lights strung across a courtyard venue my sister had dreamed about since she was 19 years old, sketching it on the back of a notebook during a boring economics lecture, a detail she'd told me herself, years earlier, back when I was still the sister she told things to first. My father cried openly during the ceremony in a way I'd only seen twice before in my life. Once at his own father's funeral, once the day Daniel was born, according to family legend. I sat in the second row, in pale blue chiffon, and I meant every ounce of joy I felt watching my sister get married, because that part, at least, was never complicated, was never touched by any of it. I loved her. That never wavered, not once in 11 months, not for a single day, whatever else had happened around the edges of that love. Dinner passed in a warm blur of clinking glasses and my father's terrible, beloved jokes, and for a while I let myself simply enjoy being there, watching my sister glow across the room in a way I had genuinely helped her become capable of glowing, years of quiet encouragement folded invisibly into that happiness even if nobody in the room would ever trace it back to me. I danced with my father to a song he'd requested specifically, an old one from when we were kids, and for 3 minutes I forgot entirely about seating charts and group chats and gold calligraphy, and simply had a father and a daughter dancing badly together in the dark. Then the toasts began, and the room settled the way rooms do when they sense something important is about to be said. Daniel went first, brief and sweet, mentioning our childhood only lightly, raising his glass to Elena with a warmth that made me proud of him in a way that had nothing to do with anything else happening that year. My father spoke next, briefly, mostly about how proud he was, his voice cracking twice, and the whole room laughed gently and dabbed at their eyes along with him. Then it was Priya's turn, and she stood, smoothing her dress, glancing once toward Elena with an ease that told me, even before she opened her mouth, exactly how comfortable she had become in this particular spotlight. The moment came at the reception during the toasts. Priya's was exactly as polished as I expected, funny, warm, a callback to an inside joke about wedding dress shopping that made half the room laugh warmly, and made my chest tighten in a way I'd gotten used to by then, a familiar, dull ache rather than a sharp one. When she sat down to applause, my mother, glowing with wine and pride and the particular euphoria of a mother watching her youngest get married, caught my eye from 2 tables away and did something I hadn't fully anticipated, hadn't planned for in any version of the moment I'd rehearsed. She stood up, tapped her glass with a fork, and announced, a little too loudly, in a voice that carried across the whole courtyard, I just want to say, Priya has been an absolute rock through all of this, an honorary daughter if there ever was one, and I don't think this family has ever felt more complete. I felt several people's eyes drift toward me, involuntarily, the way a room's attention drifts toward a fault line it's been quietly pretending not to notice for months. My Aunt Rosa actually reached over and squeezed my hand under the table, a small, silent apology for the tablecloth gazing of 11 months earlier. My mother, mid-toast momentum, still riding the high of her own sentence, turned to me directly, glass still raised. Don't you want to say something too, sweetheart? You were so quiet this whole thing. Say something nice for your sister. And there it was. The moment. Not a confrontation anyone had orchestrated, not a trap set deliberately, just an ordinary, unthinking invitation to perform one more piece of graciousness I no longer had in me to fake convincingly, one more small transaction in a currency I had finally run out of. In the half-second before I stood, I thought about the fitting room, the fluorescent light, the receipt folded soft in my wallet. I thought about the folding chairs I'd carried in the July heat, the $400 florist overcharge nobody thanked me twice for, the group chat I'd found out about from a cousin. I thought about how none of that had ever, not once, been the point of doing it. I had never wanted a ledger evened. I had only ever wanted, somewhere in the last 11 months, for someone to say my name the way they'd just said Priya's. Nobody had. And I understood, in that half-second, that I could keep waiting for it or I could stop. I stood up. I want you to know, at this point, that my hands were completely steady, that there was no tremor in my voice waiting to betray me. I had practiced this exact stillness for 3 weeks without telling almost anyone why, folding and unfolding that receipt in my wallet until the creases went soft. I could feel the whole table's attention gathering toward me, my mother's expectant smile still hovering, waiting for the gracious little sister of the bride sentiment she assumed was coming, the one she'd have nodded through and moved past within seconds. I smiled, a real smile, not a brittle one, because by then I had already made peace, quietly, with everything I was about to leave behind on that dance floor, and I said the sentence I'd carried folded in my wallet since the fitting room, the sentence I had rehearsed silently in 100 quiet moments over 3 weeks until it no longer felt like a wound, only like the truth. I love my sister enough to let this day be about her, and I love myself enough to stop explaining why I deserved to be part of it. Then I picked up my small clutch from the back of my chair, kissed my sister gently on the cheek, told her, quietly, only to her, my voice low enough that it belonged just to the two of us, that I loved her, and that I was so happy for her, and that I would call her in a few days, once things had settled. And then I walked out of that courtyard while the string lights were still glowing and the band was still paused between songs, before anyone at that table had fully finished processing what I'd just said, before the silence even had time to become uncomfortable in the way I knew somewhere it eventually would. I didn't slam a door on my way out. I didn't cry in front of anyone, not one tear, not there. I passed a cluster of guests near the courtyard entrance, people I'd known for years, and I smiled at them too, genuinely, because none of what had just happened was their fault, and because I had decided, standing in that fitting room 3 weeks earlier, that leaving with grace mattered to me more than leaving with volume. I got into my car, drove for quiet blocks with the radio off, pulled into an empty grocery store parking lot under a flickering light, and let myself have my usual 15 minutes, the only 15 minutes I ever allow myself for this kind of thing, and then, when it passed, the way it always eventually does, I wiped my face, checked it in the visor mirror until it looked like nothing had happened at all, and drove home. I found out what happened after I left the way you find out most things in a family like mine, second-hand, in careful fragments, delivered by different people over the following days, each version slightly colored by who was telling it. My father called me that night, his voice unusually careful, unusually slow, the way he talks when he's choosing every word before he lets it out. He told me the table had gone quiet for what he described as a long 10 seconds, an eternity by wedding reception standards, and that my mother had sat back down without ever finishing her toast, her glass still half-raised, forgotten in her hand. He said Marcus had been the one to eventually say something, standing up himself, glass still in hand, and telling the room, gently but plainly, without a trace of anger in his voice, "I think we should all sit with that for a second, because she's right, and I don't think enough of us have said it to her directly. Thank you for everything you've done for this family. All of you should know what she's carried, and I don't think we've ever properly told her that." He didn't say it as an accusation, my father was careful to clarify. My father said it landed like one anyway, the way true things sometimes do even when they're offered gently. My father also told me, almost as an aside, that my grandmother had leaned over to him at the table, right after I left, and said simply, "Good." It was about time someone said it, which surprised him, he admitted, because he hadn't realized how closely she'd been watching all of it either, quietly cataloging, the way I had been, the way it seems everyone in that family had been doing in their own separate silences all along. Daniel texted me 2 days later, the longest message he'd sent me in years, several paragraphs long, unusual for a brother who typically communicates in single sentences and thumbs-up emojis, apologizing, specifically, for never once stepping in during those 11 months, admitting he'd noticed almost everything and said nothing because it was easier to let Priya's warmth fill a room than to ask hard questions about why his own sister had gone quiet in her own family, questions he was ashamed, now, not to have asked sooner. He told me Priya herself had reached out to him privately, uncomfortable, saying she'd never meant to be handed something that clearly wasn't hers to take, and that she felt genuinely sick about the toast, about all of it, in hindsight, now that she could see the shape of what she'd stepped into. My mother was the hardest, unsurprisingly. She called 4 times before I finally picked up, and when I did, she didn't apologize right away. She led with, "That was humiliating," in front of everyone, a sentence that told me almost everything I needed to know about where her instincts still sat, even now, even after that long silence at the table. I let her finish. I didn't interrupt, didn't defend myself, just let her say what she needed to say first. Then I said, calmly, that I hadn't done it to humiliate her, that I'd simply stopped being willing to pretend a wound wasn't there because acknowledging it out loud was inconvenient at a party. I told her I loved her, and that I meant it fully, and that loving her didn't require me to keep quietly absorbing being told I understood my own family the least, in my own family's kitchen, over cake I had helped pick. She was quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line, longer than I expected, and then she said something I hadn't anticipated. "I don't think I understood what I was choosing, when I chose easier." It wasn't a full apology. It wasn't even close, honestly, and I noticed that immediately, the careful hedge in it. But it was the first genuinely honest sentence she'd said to me in 11 months, and I decided, in that moment, sitting alone in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, that I would let it be a beginning rather than demand it be an ending, that I owed both of us at least that much patience. Before we hung up, she asked, quietly, almost shyly, in a voice I hadn't heard from her since I was a teenager, whether I would still come to the family dinner planned for the following weekend. I told her yes. I meant it. Leaving that reception had never been about leaving my family, it had only ever been about refusing to keep disappearing quietly inside it. Elena called me the next morning, crying before I'd even finished saying hello, and this time, I let her cry without immediately rushing in to fix it for her, which was new for both of us, a small but real shift in a pattern 15 years old. She said she hadn't understood how much it had cost me, being pushed quietly to the edges of her own wedding, until she watched me actually walk away from it in front of everyone. She said she wished I'd told her sooner, wished she'd asked sooner. I told her, gently, that I had tried, twice, and that maybe next time she should listen a little earlier, not as an attack, just as the truth, offered the way I'd learned, finally, over 11 hard months, to offer truths, plainly, once, and then let go of whether it landed the way I wanted it to land. Priya texted me too, a few days after the wedding, a long message I read twice before answering. She said she'd spent the drive home turning the sentence over in her head, that she hadn't fully understood, until that exact moment, how much space she had come to occupy in a story that had never really been hers to star in. She said she was sorry, plainly, without qualifiers, without asking me to reassure her that it was fine. I told her I appreciated that, and I meant it. I didn't feel the need to punish her for 11 months of a pattern she hadn't built alone, and I told her, honestly, that I hoped she and Daniel could still be friendly, in whatever way made sense for both of them, without me becoming the reason that felt complicated going forward. It's been about 4 months since that wedding. Things aren't perfectly repaired, I don't think they need to be, or even should be, overnight, and I've stopped expecting fast healing from slow wounds that took 11 months to fully open. But something did shift, quietly, in the weeks that followed. My mother has started, in small clumsy ways, checking in without being asked anything first, a text about my work, a question about my actual week rather than a request for what I could do for someone else's week. We had lunch together 3 weeks ago, just the two of us, something we hadn't done in longer than either of us wanted to admit, and she asked me, hesitantly, what I actually needed from her going forward. I told her, honestly, that I didn't fully know yet, and she said that was fair, and we sat with that uncertainty together instead of rushing past it. Elena and I had a long dinner a few weeks ago where she finally asked me, directly, what those 11 months had actually felt like from the inside, without flinching away from the answer, and I told her, in detail, and she listened, really listened, in a way she hadn't fully let herself before, taking notes almost, the way you listen when you finally understand something matters more than you'd allowed yourself to believe. Priya and I ran into each other once, at a mutual friend's birthday gathering a couple of months ago, and she pulled me aside near the drinks table and apologized, not performatively, not for an audience, just quietly, admitting she should have said no the first time someone handed her something that clearly wasn't hers to accept. I appreciated that more than I expected to, more than I think I let on in the moment. I don't think she was ever the real problem, not truly. She was just the shape my family's hunger for, easier, happened to take that particular year, and I told her that too, gently, and she seemed relieved to hear it said plainly rather than left to guess at. I think about that dinner over cake samples a lot, more than I expected to, the one where my mother told me, so casually, that someone else understood my family better than I did after 15 years of proving otherwise in every quiet, unglamorous way a person can prove something like that, through unpaid leave, through paperwork, through a couch and a snowstorm and 90-minute drives on weekends other people spent resting. I used to think love in families was supposed to be self-evident, that if you did enough, showed up enough, carried enough, it would simply be recognized eventually, the way weight is recognized by scales, automatically, without needing to be argued for. I don't believe that anymore, not in the same simple way. I think love has to be spoken, insisted on, protected, even inside the families we'd assumed, wrongly, already knew. I've also had to sit with a harder, quieter realization, that for 15 years, I never actually asked to be seen. I simply did the work and waited, silently, to be noticed for it, and when I finally wasn't, I treated the silence as a verdict on my worth rather than what it more honestly was. A habit my whole family had built together, one where the person who never complained simply stopped getting asked what she needed. I'm trying, now, to unlearn that habit in myself before I ask anyone else to unlearn it in how they treat me. I've started saying things out loud now that I would have swallowed a year ago, small things, mostly. That I'm tired. That I'd like help. That a particular comment stung more than I let on in the moment. It feels strange, still, like speaking a second language I'm only just becoming fluent in, but I notice my family listening differently when I do it, leaning in slightly instead of moving past me to the next item on the agenda. If there's a moral in any of this, it isn't cut off anyone who ever hurts you, because I didn't do that, and I don't think that was ever the right response for me, or maybe even for most people in a situation like mine. The moral, if I have one, is smaller and I think more useful in the long run. You don't have to raise your voice to draw a line that finally holds. You don't have to make a scene to stop disappearing quietly inside one that's already been made around you without your consent. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do, in a room that has quietly decided you're replaceable, is to smile, say exactly one true sentence, and walk out the door before anyone in that room has even finished deciding what to make of it. I still don't fully know what would have happened if I'd stayed quiet that night, if I'd sat back down, said something gracious about my sister, absorbed one more year the way I'd absorbed the 11 months before it. I suspect I do know, actually, if I'm honest with myself. I suspect I'd still be standing in the corner of my own family today, holding the folding chairs, being told, gently, warmly, by people who loved me in their own limited way, that someone else simply understood us better than I ever had. I didn't want to find out. So I left instead, quietly, on my own terms, with my dignity fully intact and my voice never once raised, and it turned out to be the loudest thing I have ever done in that family without ever raising my voice at all. Sometimes I think about how easily that entire year could have gone unspoken, absorbed the way every other year had been, filed away under the same quiet heading as everything before it. It didn't, this time, only because I finally let one true sentence exist out loud instead of folding it back into my wallet for good. If any part of this sounded familiar to you, if you've ever been the one who showed up for 15 years only to be told, casually, over cake, that someone else understands your family better, I want you to know something clearly, the way I wish someone had told me a year ago. You don't owe anyone a performance of gratitude for being quietly replaced. You're allowed to leave the table. You're allowed to smile while you do it, and mean the smile completely. I think often about how close I came to never saying anything at all, how easy it would have been to keep absorbing, quietly, for another year, and another after that, mistaking my own silence for strength simply because it had always been rewarded as strength before. I don't say any of this to be admired for leaving. I say it because I suspect there's someone reading this who is, right now, sitting at their own version of that table, holding their own fork very carefully, telling themselves it's fine, it's practical, it's not a judgment. It might not be fine. You're allowed to notice that. You're allowed to write your own true sentence down, fold it carefully, and carry it quietly until the moment finally comes. If this story meant something to you, tell me in the comments which sentence you'd have said in that courtyard, and if you haven't already, subscribe, because there are more stories like this one still to come, every single week.